This is a bombshell book which just came out last week, and it makes some pretty hair-raising charges against a lot of folks involved with the National Football League. The title says a lot of it: Interference, How Organized Crime Influences Professional Football. Please welcome its author, Dan Moldea. Dan? What are you hearing from the powers that be? Anything?
They just want me to go away right now.
We've spoken to them, and they don't want to talk about it either. They have nothing to say.
But they're not denying anything, and they're not refuting any of the facts.
Let me talk about some of the major charges. And I just jotted down a few of the. I mean, you're saying, for example, virtually every team owner gambles on football teams.
Well, I'm saying that no fewer than 26.
That's
NFL team owners have documented ties. Past and present NFL team owners have documented business ties to either the gambling community and or the organized crime syndicate. I'm also saying that no fewer than 70 NFL games have been fixed.
Now that's pretty rough stuff. You're saying no fewer than 70 NFL games have been fixed. You mean the outcome, the point spread, what?
I'm saying the points were shaved and thereby fixed. Yeah.
How does this happen?
Well, I first got into this about 1983. Vincent Persani, who is the head of the Michigan State Attorney General's Office Organized Crime Division, told me, if you're going to do a book about the NFL, Dan, you're going to have to get into this guy, Don Dawson, because he was fixing games. We knew it. I went to my friends and my sources at the Internal Revenue Service, the Organized Crime Intelligence Division. They said Don Dawson was fixing games. I went to the FBI, the Organized Crime and Racketeering Section of the Justice Department, and Strike Force field offices. Everybody told me what Don Dawson was fixing games. At that point, I had enough evidence to print that allegedly Don Dawson was fixing NFL games. He was a major bookmaker in the Midwest. I then went to Dawson, I tracked him down, I jumped through all kinds of hoops to interview him, and when I interviewed him on about the 7th or 8th interview, he admitted to me that he had personally participated in the fixing of no fewer than 32 NFL games.
How does that happen?
He liked to work with the quarterback. He would go to the quarterback would come to him and say, I need some bread. What's the line on the game this week? And the bookmaker would say, you guys are favored by 6 points. And then the reply was, we're not going to cover the spread. And basically that was it.
Now, do you name players?
Oh, sure. I name players. And also in 1979, I go into the specifics of 8 fixed games that were allegedly fixed by 2 referees who were investigated by both the FBI and the IRS. And I list the 8 games on page 308 of the book.
Yeah. Are drugs involved in this at all?
Yeah, drugs are the real variable in all of this. I mean, when a drug dealer has a relationship with a player, there's an extortionate edge to that situation whereby that dealer has that player's career in his hands because of the drug policies within the NFL for throwing a person out. Within the past few years, no fewer than 9 NFL teams have been investigated because their players were receiving drugs from gamblers. Now, I know gamblers who, on principle, refuse to sell drugs, but I'm not aware of many drug dealers who on principle refuse to gamble. And the key here is that the NFL is very aware of the fact, and their worst case scenario is the player who's strung out can't pay his bill to his dealer, and so the dealer comes to him and says, hey, you owe me money, and the dealer says, and the player says, I told you I can't pay it, and the dealer says, that's okay, but now you're going to come and work for me.
Now, the obvious question, you're talking about all these games being fixed, you're talking about all these people involved, you're talking about going to various agencies, and they're saying who the people are involved. Why has this gone uncovered if this is the case?
What I'm also alleging in the book is that no fewer than 50 legitimate investigations of corruption within the NFL have been either suppressed or just flat out killed as a result of a sweetheart relationship between NFL security, which is the internal police force within the league, and a variety of federal and state and local law enforcement agencies. I'm a big baseball fan, and I have more respect for baseball right now because of the way it's handled the Pete Rose case in the open and honest manner that it's handled this case than I've ever had before. I have more confidence in baseball because it's handled.
Well, how do these investigations get quashed?
Basically, the NFL security people, who are all former Justice Department people, will go to their colleagues, their old colleagues in the Justice Department or in these various law enforcement agencies, and they'll say, we can handle this internally. Let us handle it internally so that we're not getting all the publicity that we would be getting. And so to all intents and purposes, these investigations I can cite chapter and verse. Again, I cite about 50 in the book.
The story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Yeah, so you've written 10 books at this point?
10 books, right.
Okay, and they're all within the true crime genre per se, about organized crime and corruption. So for someone like you, I mean, like whenever you were growing up, was journalism what you always aspired to be in this particular form of it, or you just happened to get into this through happenstance?
I wanted to be a pro football player.
Really? Mm-hmm. Well, your father was a college football player at Ohio State?
My dad was a great athlete. He was a great track and field star at Ohio State. He played on Paul Brown's freshman team in 1940, and then Dad got drafted, and he was expected to be one of the starters, I think, in the 41 Ohio State team. And then he got drafted, and Ohio State co-shared the national championship with, I think, Georgia Tech, I think, that year. And military, and when he got out, he returned to Ohio State, and he was asked to rejoin the football team, but he got trapped in some play and got injured, and he was told leave the day-to-day football playing to the kids. So they made him a place kicking specialist. Mm-hmm. And so Dad won a big game against Northwestern back in 1946. And if you look in ESPN wildest finishes in Ohio State football, my dad's heroics that day are featured as the number one wildest finish in Ohio State sports history.
That's impressive too, that he was a specialized place kicker at that time, because I don't think you really had too many rosters that had that.
Well, he was close to Lou Groza, who became a place kicking specialist when he grew out of being a tackle with the Cleveland Browns. My dad was very close with Danny Lavelli, who was a Pro Football Hall of Fame guy, Cleveland Browns guy. In fact, after Interference came out, I did a show with Danny Lavelli, and I didn't know how Danny Lavelli was going to feel about what I had done. I mean, I really, I looked up to Danny Lavelli when I was growing up as a kid. Mom and Dad and Danny Lavelli and his wife and our families would get together from time to time. Dad was friends with McCafferty, the guy who was Don McCafferty, who was the head coach of the Baltimore Colts. Yeah. And I think it was in his first season he won a Super Bowl, and I think he was fraternity brothers with Don McCafferty at Ohio State. And Dad wanted to be a coach. That's what he wanted to do. And the war. Dad loved his war experience and his military experience. And he was in the 357 Flight Squadron, and he was not a pilot. He was a trainer. But he had guys like Kit Carson and Chuck Yeager, the first man eventually to break the sound barrier, as among those people he trained. And so Dad was, bottom line is I really looked up to my dad. He was one of the finest people I ever knew. And sadly, he died at age 64. He was as I say, he wanted to be a football coach. Mm-hmm. And sadly, I came along and I kind of probably wrecked that for him a little bit. And but I wanted to be. I thought I had what it took. I could catch anything you threw at me, anything. I just throw it 20 feet over my head. Somehow I'll bring it in. And so my first 2 years in high school, I rode the bench, but I figured my senior year was going to be my big year. And then my coach sat me down during the off season and told me I was going to be benched in my senior year too, in favor of two juniors who were outstanding ball players. So outstanding, in fact, that both of them wound up going to Northwestern University on scholarships, and both of them wound up playing for the Minnesota Vikings. So I ended up getting X'd out by Jim Lash, who was a wide receiver for Minnesota and played in Super Bowls, and with Steve Craig, who was a tight end for the Minnesota Vikings. So I had some stiff competition back then. I don't know anybody else who who could claim that. But it did end my career. But I was elected senior class president that year, so student politics became my salvation, and I became a student activist after that. And that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be I wanted to be a person who led a committed life.
Mm-hmm.
And I was deeply affected by the Kent State shootings on May 4th, 1970. I was a student at the University of Akron. Kent State was about 12 miles northeast of Akron, and which is my hometown. And once again, I wanted to lead a committed life. I worked in the civil rights movement for after graduation. I worked as assistant director of a federal poverty agency. I taught a course called Racism and Poverty at Kent State in the Honors and Experimental College, where I went to graduate school. I went to graduate school at Kent. When I came to Washington later on, the last job I had was in 1979 after the Hoffa Wars. My book on Jimmy Hoffa's Rise and Fall came out. I was just burned out, and I needed a job. And a friend of mine, my girlfriend was a women's rights activist, and so she had a friend who was on her board of directors of her organization where she was president. And her friend asked me if I would become her executive assistant to the agency. And at the agency was John Lewis, the great civil rights icon. And I ended up writing some speeches for John Lewis, which was one of the greatest honors of my life. So I've always viewed myself as being a fighter. And,
sure.
And that's the way I took on my career as an investigative journalist. While I was assistant director of that federal poverty agency, we got shook down by a mob guy, and the executive director of the agency was allegedly embezzling money. I was the one who caught him.
Okay.
And so I confronted him with the evidence. He fired me. I went across the street to the prosecutor's office in Ravenna, Ohio, and a scandal erupted. I was fired. I was out of a job. I was getting threatened. I didn't understand why. I thought Elliot Ness and the Untouchables had cleaned up the mob back in the 30s. I didn't even think they existed. There was a gentleman by the name of William Ellis who was an attorney in Akron, Ohio. He was a junior counsel for the NAACP during the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court fight. And he owned a small newspaper that serviced the black community in northeastern Ohio called The Reporter.
Okay.
And he asked me to be his token white columnist. And so I was the white guy who had a column there. And so I was writing about, pretty lightweight stuff at first. But eventually I was put in contact with a gentleman by the name of Mac McKinley. And in December 1974, I started investigating the Teamsters Union with the help of this guy who gave me all these secret documents. And then I befriended a guy named John Whitney, a great investigative journalist from the Wall Street Journal. I did some work for him on the Teamsters and a series that he had done following a series I had done for my own newspaper. And then on July 30th, 1975, 8 months after I'd started all this, Jimmy Hoffa, the former president of the Teamsters Union, disappeared and was presumed murdered. And so I hit the ground running, working with NBC News, the Detroit Free Press, Jack Anderson, and other places. And I eventually came out with my first book about the rise and fall of Jimmy Hoffa in 1978. So that's pretty much where I started. Not quite where I thought I was going to end up, but I always wanted to be a writer. I mean, I may have wanted to be, like at first, an astronaut, but I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a football player, but I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a civil rights activist, but I wanted to be a writer, or a lawyer and a writer.
It always stuck around in some sort of career attribution or aspirations. I
always found that sitting down and writing about things was a good way to get your head together. And I had an extraordinary professor in my life in school who thought I had some talent, and so she sort of mentored me. Her name was Nancy Nolte. I knew her entire family, her husband, her children, and everything else. They were just wonderful people. And Mrs. Nolte, as I always called her, even though she was a PhD, she always, sort of looked out for me. And I've been blessed with some great mentors. Mrs. Nolte, Walter Sheridan, who was Bobby Kennedy's right-hand man when he was Attorney General at the Department of Justice. Jack Tobin, the great writer from the Los Angeles Times. Irving R. Levine from NBC News. And my friend Bob Davis, who was a war hero, a guy I knew from Ohio, who always remained in my life. He was my touchstone, probably the smartest guy I've ever known.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So obviously that experience is definitely going to teach you to be a fighter, and it definitely came in handy after you published this book, Interference, because obviously the NFL had a lot to come after you for, and put a lot out there to try to discredit the book or discredit other aspects of your career, so you could say.
It wasn't. The NFL never laid a glove on me. It was the
right.
It was the New York Times that ran interference, if I can use that word, for the NFL. But what had happened was in January of 1983, Frontline had done a story called The Unauthorized History of the NFL.
On Frontline tonight, a story of football. But it is not played on the field, nor cheered from the stands. The action of this story takes place off the field. It's a story about bookies. It's a story about the outlaw line, football, illegal gambling, and the mafia.
And I knew two of the researchers on it, and one of the top producers. And the show really got beaten up. Just really got smacked around in the press. And I had mixed feelings about it. I liked my friends and everything else, but I thought they had missed some things. They offered me they had $250,000 worth of research that had gone into this, and so they offered me everything. They offered me, after all the grief they had taken and everything else, they said, "Let's see what you could do with it, Dan." And so I did. By this time I had done my book, The Hoffa Wars. That was a pretty big book. I had done a book called The Honey. My dad got pancreatic cancer, and so I went back home. And as you can tell, my dad is my favorite person in the world. When Dad got sick, I left Washington and I went back home for a year to help the family with him. I rented a house a couple of miles away from where my family lived, so I wasn't dealing with, imposing on them on a day-to-day basis. And then I would pick up Dad, and then we'd go up to the Cleveland Clinic for his radiation treatments. And then, on the way back, we'd stop and play golf or go eat lunch or something like that. And but Dad knew that I had been offered all this information from Frontline. And once again, that was, big football star and everything else.
Right.
And on his deathbed, I said to Dad, listen, you know where I'm going with my career now and everything else. What do you think? And I said, you got any advice for me? And he said, and he got very quiet, and he said, yeah. He said, don't write that goddamn book about the NFL. Because my dad knew that book would break my heart, which it did.
Yeah.
I put so much work into that book. And it's not my favorite book that I did, but I think it's one of my best. And I'm going to be remembered for this book. That's for goddamn sure. Just like Bernie Parrish is remembered for They Call It a Game. I think Interference is a book that's certainly going to stand the test of time. I mean, I was during the book tour on September 11th, 1989. I was on Nightline, ABC Nightline program, and on the program I was with two guys I liked and respected. Warren Welsh, who was the head of NFL security, which, as you know, is the internal police force within the league, and I was on with Roxy Roxborough, who was the top odds maker in Las Vegas. And during my research trips and everything else, I got to know these guys, and I liked them. I considered them to be friends, actually. And which was bad for me that night on Nightline, because I wanted guys I didn't like to be on against me so I could eat them alive. That's what I do.
Yeah.
And so instead I was with two guys I liked. And so, but during the conversation, during the final 2 minutes of the program, we were asked to sum things up. And I said, I had the audacity to say, let me tell you what's going on in the NFL. The NFL owners want to control the gambling themselves. They want it right in the stadium, just like you could go to a horse racing track and go to a pari-mutuel window and make a bet on the game that you're watching or any other game that's going on simultaneously in the league. And Warren really dove on. Have you seen this clip?
I have, yeah. They completely brushed you off.
And Roxy Roxborough is as sophisticated as he is.
Yeah.
He even, mocked me for this. And I said, guys, remember where you heard it first.
Discussion now on gambling in the NFL. Gentlemen, we're down literally to our last 2 minutes, so I'd like a concise answer to the very simple question. Mr. Welsh, gambling goes on all over America. Why not legalize it if you can't stop it?
We don't need more betting, and particularly on the National Football League. It's a spectator sport, it's an exciting sport, and we don't need more gambling.
Well, that was concise. Mr. Roxborough, you think it's a good idea to legalize the action?
Well, listen, we already have legalized gambling, and we have 43 states with legal pari-mutuel wagering, 31 states with legal lotteries. The states are already in the gambling business. They like it because they're generating revenue for worthwhile causes. So why not generate more revenue through sports wagering for other worthwhile causes? I don't have any problems with it at all.
Dan Moldea, your principal concern is organized crime's influence. Wouldn't legalized gambling diminish the influence of organized crime?
No, I don't think so. I think it's going to enhance it. Basically what I think is happening is that I think there's going to be a law enforcement disaster in Oregon. I think there's going to be proliferation of organized crime activity in Oregon. I think what's happening in the NFL is that the NFL owners want to control the gambling themselves. I think they want to have it right in the stadium, just as you would at a horse racing track, where you could go to a pari-mutuel window and make a bet on your favorite team or any other team that's going on, any other game that's going simultaneously in the league.
That's too bizarre, Dan. Too bizarre.
I think that's coming because I think that's why Jim Finks is being held up as NFL commissioner, because they want a commissioner who's going to be a little more sensitive to the problem of gambling
totally
in the
outrageous.
NFL.
Totally
We'll see.
Mr. Welsh,
okay.
Remember where you heard it first.
You have any sense that Mr. Moldea is predicting the future?
Absolutely not. I think he is 100% incorrect. Talk to Gene Klein, former owner of the San Diego Chargers. He agrees with that. The NFL owners want to control the gambling. They want to control the vigorish. He's a former owner. He's a former owner who wishes he could have controlled the gambling and the vigorish. You have to understand that these new owners, the 11 owners who are stopping Pete Rozelle from finally retiring after a fine job that he did, are putting themselves in a position where they're holding a lot of paper, they're holding a lot of debt, they're spending $100 million for the teams. Television revenues aren't going to carry the day for these NFL owners for long.
Gentlemen,
they need the gambling, they need the vigorish.
Absolutely
incorrect.
It's 11 to 5 that we're out of time. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Tomorrow night in this time slot, another in the ABC News Series.
And
I think Warren tried to discredit you by saying it was Gene Klein, who was a former owner or something like that.
Right. But it was Gene Klein who was the one who made me hip to this, what was going on. And so Gene Klein, a former owner of the San Diego Chargers, he said, Dan, I'm telling you, this is where it's going. And the owners are very interested. Television revenues aren't going to carry the day for us. Mm-hmm. We need gambling. We need the vigorish, which is exactly what I said on Nightline. And here it is, X amount of years later. And here's this creep, Dan Snyder, who owns the ex-Washington Redskins team, mm-hmm. who has built in the new stadium. They have a sports book in the new stadium. Exactly what I predicted. Yeah. But it's amazing that no one remembers this. It's like I said, nothing at all.
I think that adds to the sort of stature that the book has now, because everyone I talk to who's read the book absolutely loves it. Like, there's very few people that I've met who've actually, and maybe it's just more of a product of the time, but like for me, it's always been a book that people are very fascinated by. And especially for me, because I love learning about like the inner circle of like the ownership of the NFL. And this book covers a lot of territory about the owners who have had relationships with bookmakers and in many cases who came into the NFL because of their gambling ties. So for me, it was really fascinating to take me into a subculture, or not even a subculture really, but something that was a big part of the NFL's history. So let's go into the makings of the NFL security department, because obviously, as we mentioned, there's been a long-standing relationship between the NFL and bookmakers at varying degrees. Let's look at like the pre-Rozelle era with the 1946 NFL championship game, whenever the Giants and the Bears were going at each other, and two Giants players had been approached about throwing a game or had shaving points in some sort of fix. I guess Burt Bell had found out, I guess a week or before or after, but that they hadn't reported, so they were reprimanded. Can you give a little context how that event sort of changed the outlook for the league, and then what were some of the steps moving forward that they wanted to do?
I don't really have. I sort of went with the public record on that particular case, and I interviewed the with the exception of Jim Hamilton,
yeah,
who was gone by the time I interviewed all of the heads of NFL security. My book is really a history of NFL security. That's what it is. And the Hakes and Philchuck, was that
yeah.
it? They were the guys. The information came to the world of professional football and Bert Bell and the others, who was commissioner at the time, and it was about that the game was fixed. The bookmakers needed 10 points to cover, and as I recall, the final score of the game was 24-14, so they covered. And so I think that became the beginning of it, but it really wasn't until the Paul Hornung, Alex Karras scandal in 1960, I guess it was. That's when the NFL, Pete Rozelle, who I thought was a very fine commissioner, honest guy, that's when they decided to get serious. And they ended up getting Jim Hamilton, who was head of the Los Angeles Police Department's Organized Crime Intelligence Division. They brought him in to handle these investigations. And then Jim wasn't there for very long. And then he was replaced by Bill Hunley, who I knew pretty well. I knew him from my investigations of Jimmy Hoffa, because he was the head of the Organized Crime and Racketeering section in the Justice Department during Bobby Kennedy's term as Attorney General. And I must say that I view Bobby Kennedy as the greatest crime fighter this country has ever had. When he was chief counsel of the Senate Rackets Committee from 1957 to 1960, he was eating mafia guys for breakfast. And when he became Attorney General of the United States in 1961 with the inauguration of his brother, he started eating mob guys for lunch and dinner too. Bobby Kennedy was the greatest crime fighter this country's ever had. He assembled the greatest team of crime fighters of all, one of whom was Bill Hunley. And Bill Hunley's partner was a guy named Pelican. And the two of them wound up creating a firm to do investigations, and they were hired by the NFL.
That was Intertel?
Intertel came out, I'm trying to remember, I'm going to stand by whatever's in the book, but I'm trying to remember whether they created Intertel and then it became part of it. I was a close friend of Tom McKeon, who was the executive director of Intertel. And of course, that was, part of the Resorts International scene down in the Bahamas. And so
they also ran a lot of private security for like Howard Hughes and a lot of Vegas casinos, right? Yeah.
Right. And got tarred up pretty good. They really got. Bill Hunley was one of my heroes. For my book. I mean, I really looked up to Bill. And then
didn't Bobby Kennedy also introduce Pete Rozelle to Jim Hamilton?
I think you're right. I believe that is correct.
You can't tell the history of the NFL security department without Bobby Kennedy, then, I guess.
Again, Bobby Kennedy's my favorite person in American history. So that's.
Now, for the Paul Hornung and Alex Karras suspension, that actually involved Don Dawson too, correct? Actually, from what you can remember, can you explain to the audience like what the Karras and Hornung suspension was for those who may not be familiar with their suspension in 1963?
Alex Karras was a tackle for the Detroit Lions. Paul Hornung was a Heisman Trophy winner who went with the Green Bay Packers. Both great players. Paul Hornung was a great running back, and I interviewed Alex Karras at length, and Karras told me that he had some friends who were underworld people, and he says he never did business with them or anything like that, but there were certain things that he did where he got caught, and Paul Hornung also did some things where he got caught, but the difference was that Paul Hornung showed regret. Alex Karras was defiant.
Yeah.
And so Karras walked away from football and became an actor and appeared in several very popular films.
Including Paper Lion.
Right,
Played himself, yeah.
George Plimpton, yeah. And whereas Paul Hornung came back into football after a year's suspension, and he wound up in the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
And so I talked to Karras at length. Hornung was, he wasn't real cooperative. He talked to me a little bit, but anybody I could call, I call. I had a good friend who was very close to the NFL, and he had everybody's number. And so I abused his goodwill with reckless abandon. And I called everybody I could possibly call. I talked to everyone from Johnny Unitas to Sonny Jurgensen to Don Dawson. Len Dawson, Weeb Eubank,
Sammy
Emmett
Ball.
Thomas. I talked to a lot of people. John Hadel, Lance Allworth. Just off the top of my head, I was very proud of all these guys I talked to, and they were very candid with. I was surprised how candid Johnny Unitas was, especially about the '58 championship game, and which I assume things had happened. I think from everything I heard and understood from Weeb Eubank and from Johnny Unitas, that there was a decision that came in from Carroll Rosenblum to go for the touchdown and not go for the field goal. That was the information I had in the 58. However, Bubba Smith, a defensive player for the Baltimore Colts, claimed in a Playboy interview that the Joe Namath Super Bowl, the 1969 Super Bowl, is fixed.
Yeah.
So I really dug into this. I wanted to find out if any of this had any merit at all. And I found the bookmaker who laid off Carroll Rosenblum's bet. Carroll Rosenblum did bet $1 million on that game, but the evidence is clear, and I've seen it, that Carroll Rosenblum bet on his own team. The 1969 Super Bowl was not fixed.
And this is was his bookmaker Gil Beckley?
He was one of the top guys around Gil Beckley. I had from my work on Jimmy Hoffa and my work on the mob. Since then, my book Hunting of Cain, about a contract killing in Ohio, my book Dark Victory, about the Hollywood and the mafia. I had collected some terrific sources, and I used some of those sources for my book on pro football and the mob, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, that when I first got into when I would go into it, one of my sources took me to a bookmaking joint, and I'm trying to think it was Vegas or Chicago. I think it was Chicago. And the most sophisticated piece of machinery they had there would be like a hand crank adding machine. This is like 1987, 88, 89, something like that, when the book came out in 89. Nowadays, mafia guys aren't necessarily, knuckle draggers and eighth grade dropouts. These guys are Wharton grads, they're Harvard MBAs.
Lawyers.
These guys are well educated. These guys are businessmen. They have gone online. They have gone high tech, and they have gone offshore. And, as I say, legalizing gambling is going to cause a proliferation of illegal gambling because, when you gamble with these outfits, if you're gambling with the state or if you're gambling with one of these companies, whether they're aligned with the NFL or not, and most of them are, you're in a situation where they're going to be taking a skim of the pool of bets. I mean, you could get a bigger bang for your buck. Let's put it this way: after you deal with taxation and everything else on your winnings, you can get a bigger bang for your buck from Charlie the bookie, the friendly local bookmaker at the corner bar, who is still going to make you put up $11 to win 10, and only taking a 10% commission, or vigorish as they call it, on the losing Betsy books.
Yeah.
And plus, Charlie's he'll extend credit to you. And so as a result of all of this, we have a situation where I think it's inevitable that sports is going to be damaged, perhaps fatally, as a result of the legalization of sports gambling. And I'm saying this as a guy who said on Nightline in 1989 that, mark my words, you're going to see sports books in NFL stadiums. To me, it's inevitable. You're going to have these situations where sports gambling is going to compromise team members, and it's going to compromise players, and it's inevitable. NFL security, to further answer your question, NFL security is not an operation where they uncover scandals and then they reveal them to the public. That's not what they do. They find out what's going on. They get some information. They find out what's going on. And instead of revealing it, they then come in and try to tamp it down. They don't want this. Their job, NFL security's job, is to protect the multi-billion-dollar investments of the NFL team owners. That's what they do.
Well,
that's what it's all about.
And a big way they did that was getting information from guys like Gil Beckley on what lines were moving and anything that he heard in the underworld, right?
Well, it was Hundley and I got into a real dispute about that. Where remember, Beckley was murdered in 1970, and obviously I never had a chance to talk to him. But Hundley, he resented the fact that I was objecting to him dealing with Beckley. But to me, it was giving Beckley a blank check to do whatever he wanted to do, and without consequence. I mean, people are already horrified when they hear, oh, so and so mob guy is an FBI informant. Mm-hmm. Well, in my experience, they're all FBI informants. Yeah. Why? Because when you have a situation where you're giving information, you get yourself a privileged sanctuary by doing this, where you have a mob guy will feed information to a detective or a FBI agent or somebody at NFL security, and are they feeding information about their own people, their own families? No, they're feeding information about their competition.
Yeah,
that's what they're doing. They're not going to feed information about themselves, but as a result, they get this privileged sanctuary where they're not going to be touched. And Gil Beckley got away with a lot. We knew about. I talked to some people from Nassau County on Long Island, and Beckley was accused of fixing 19 games. Mm-hmm. 19 games. They had evidence of it, and the evidence ended up being tamped down. And so, the establishment needs the information in order to keep the game honest. And I believe everyone wants to keep the game honest.
Yeah.
Except for those who are trying to corrupt it.
What about in terms of moving forward? I mean, because obviously one argument that you hear against the corruption of the game is that they make too much money for anyone to try to bribe them. But obviously there's still the blackmail element, right? Would you say if organized crime is going to influence a game in that direction, it would have to be through extortion, blackmail, some sort of racket in that say?
It's like the Pete Rose situation.
Mm-hmm.
The Pete Rose situation blew up, I think, in March of '89. And what had become known was that Pete Rose was betting on baseball.
Mm-hmm.
And, but he wasn't betting with a friend or something like that.
Yeah.
He was betting with a bookmaker, a guy named Ron Peters, I think was one of them. And once you have that kind of a relationship with an illegal person, a criminal, or let's say you're getting cocaine from, Jimmy the dealer at the bar down the street. Once you have that deal, you have given your career to that person. That person owns you at that point. So I think a lot of that is the big problem. It's right. It's not. No one's going to end up going broke buying drugs. Although this lawyer down in South Carolina who just got convicted for murdering his wife and son claimed to have been taking 60 60 pills a day of fentanyl or whatever he was taking. I mean, it was, and he had made millions and millions and millions of dollars, and he was claiming that all this money wound up. I think that was a big part of the puzzle that was missing in that case, is what the hell did he do with all these millions of dollars? Certainly it could have been from from buying drugs.
Yeah.
I think the bee's pissing me. If I were to look into this thing as an investigator, I would be looking at this guy was being blackmailed by somebody about something. And that's what I think the danger in the NFL is, that an association between a player and an illegal gambler or a drug dealer. I mean, I know gamblers who on principle refuse to sell drugs. Mm-hmm. I'm not aware of many drug dealers who on principle refuse to gamble.
Right.
So I think that needs to be understood. It's the association. And once again, NFL security, their job is to monitor that. And when things like that happen, they will handle these things quietly because they don't want to impact the multi-billion-dollar investments of the NFL team owners.
Not at all. Hush, hush. Well, do you want to tell people where they can find you, your website, and where they can order the book?
Yeah, the book has had a very difficult history. It was published initially in 1989 by William Morrow. Mm-hmm. I received a $50,000 advance for it after I had published a story in Regardi's magazine about the NFL, and it was, I was kind of embracing the frontline conclusions probably more than I should have. In the book, I sorted it out, and I was very critical of the frontline. So even though these were friends of mine who had collected the information, the book never came out in paperback. It never came out in paperback because I sued right away. I mean, the Moldea v. New York Times started in early 1990, and once again, it went on till October 1994 when the Supreme Court allowed the May 1994 decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit rendered its decision in Moldea 2, their bizarre reversal, the unprecedented moment in American jurisprudence, which cost me my win. And so then in 2013, I think it was, there was a company called Open Road Media, which decided to start a forbidden bookshelf collection, and it was a collection of books which have been targeted for to be suppressed or to be censored. And of the 27 books on the list, 3 of them are mine. The Hoffa Wars, which was a blatant attempt to suppress the Hoffa Wars. There's
also the CIA book that was written by a guy who used to be a football player who became a CIA agent, Deadly Deceit.
I know the books on the list. Who wrote? I don't know who wrote it.
His name is Frank McGee. He was a player at Notre Dame who then became a player for the Green Bay Packers, and then he became a CIA agent. Did a lot of work in Southeast Asia.
My book, The Hoffa Wars, was on it. Mm-hmm. Dark Victory, my book on Ronald Reagan and the Mafia in Hollywood when he was president of the Screen Actors Guild. And as president, the relationships therein, my major characters being Ronald Reagan, Lou Wasserman, the head of MCA, the most powerful man in the entertainment industry, and Sid Korshak, the link between the legitimate business world and organized crime. Those are my 3 characters, Reagan, Wasserman, and Korshak. And then the third book was Interference. They took Interference, which came out in '89. But these books were all Kindles. Now, Open Road has made a deal. In fact, they just signed a contract about a week ago for all 3 of these books to go into paperback. There's a company who wants to turn the entire forbidden bookshelf, all 27 books, into not just Kindles, but paperbacks. Cool. So Interference, if you just go to my name, Moldea, Moldea, and my website being, I don't sell books on my website, Moldea.com. If you go to investigativejournalism.com, it comes to me. If you go to freedomofinformationact.com, it comes to me. And if you go to Moldea.com, it comes to me. And I don't sell books there, but again, the Kindle is reasonably priced. the hardback for interference is sometimes can be expensive. I've seen interference sell for $2, and I've seen interference sell for over $1,000, depending on when it's in the news.
Gotcha.
So
awesome.
It's been a trip, but it's been the history of interference has been a rough road, and but I'm as proud of that book as anything I've ever done.
Yeah, well, I definitely put it like in my top 10 bookshelf just for the fact that you took me into a world that I never really, considered before. But I'm glad you took the time to come on here and talk about it. And whenever the paperback comes out, I would encourage everyone to go out and buy it.
Thank you.